Okay, so whenever I think about this next speaker, I think of an animated back and forth he had with PA leader Mark Cully over the vegetarian diet and the carcinogenic effects of meat eating. He's been described as everyone's favourite and an absolute force for good. A founding member, leading activist, and speaker for the white rights and white advocacy group, the National Justice Party, a member of the National Justice Party's Central Committee, host of the popular current affairs programme Modern Politics. This fella is a really impressive speaker. And if you don't mind me saying, a lovely man. I've spoken to him a little bit. Traveling all the way from the United States of America, please give a huge round of applause for the indomitable Warren Balogh.
Well, Mark told me to try to keep this under 25 minutes. No mad ramblings were his exact words. So this is my first time to England, and after this speech is released, I fear that the liberal police state won't let me back in again. So the way I look at it is I've got 25 minutes to deliver one message to the British people on British soil. Well, first of all, I want to thank Mark, Sam, Laura, everyone here for giving me this opportunity. To say I'm honored and humbled to be here would be putting it mildly. Thank you. A friend of mine from the States recently visited you guys here, and his visit prompted Sam to make a short video called England Through the Eyes of a Foreigner. And that's what I want to speak to you about today. Not how I see you guys as a visitor to the UK, but how you are seen by the rest of the world. And where I have to begin with this is my own experience. When I was very young, I didn't even realize there was a medieval period in other countries besides England. I thought that castles, knights, princesses, kings, these were all just English history. I thought that a long time ago, before America, we all lived over in England with the castles and the knights and the kings. I had a beautiful children's book about St. George and the Dragon. And I'm happy to say I've recently had the pleasure of reading this again to my 3-year-old son. When I was around his age, that was my view of England. St. George and the Dragon, also Robin Hood and his merry men, Sherwood Forest, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, the sword Excalibur, the wizard Merlin. As a little kid, I thought all this happened in England, and I found this English history much cooler than American history. It was only later that I realized other countries also went through a medieval period, like France and Italy and Germany, and that not everyone in the age of castles and kings and knights spoke English with a British accent. Now, of course, most of these images were created for me by movies, by television, and by books. Nevertheless, those images stamped themselves on my young mind and formed a powerful element in my early imagination, along with countless other young boys and girls in the United States and around the world. When I was around 6 years old, I saw the 1980s BBC production of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe on public television. And then I read all the Narnia books by C.S. Lewis, and this further developed my love of all things British. Again, I'm certainly not alone in this. As Americans, images and impressions of England and of the British Isles pile on in our imagination as we grow up. My father showed me the film Zulu when I was a young adult, and for a while I thought that there was nothing cooler than British redcoats, 100 men facing 4,000 Zulu with nothing but bayonets and stiff upper lips. I used to actually pretend I was manning the lines there, fighting them off on the mealie bags. And as a teenager with a developing love of history, I became obsessed with the Elizabethan age. It was just so fascinating, of the Tudors, of the time of Shakespeare, and of the age of exploration. I could go on, but what I'm saying is, Britain, you live in our heads and in our hearts. You're always on our mind. Every Halloween, we watch or read movies about Jonathan Harker and his band of friends as they do battle with Dracula in old London. Every Christmas, we're back with Ebenezer Scrooge as he's visited by Marley's ghost. Charles Dickens, Byron, Keats, Shelley, Jane Austen. Your country lives in our imagination and is a huge part of our inner world as Americans. The history of these islands are to us as the exploits of a renowned ancestor. Part myth, part reality, but stories we've told ourselves over and over so many times, they become legends. So it's difficult for me to describe to you the sense of disbelief, the horror that we feel when this legendary view is contrasted with the reality that you're experiencing in Britain today. You almost need to be not from here to really see the big picture. If I can borrow from C.S. Lewis, we see you as Aslan, the mighty British lion, as the children saw him when he was shaved, harnessed, and bound helpless on the stone table, being tormented by a mob of sniggering goblins. We just don't understand why the lion, who was once the terror of his enemies, is now allowing himself to lie prostrate as his cowardly foes heap indignities and humiliations on him. We don't understand why the lion doesn't just break his bonds and use his lion's strength and his lion's roar to send them all scurrying back to their hiding places. And you were the terror of your enemies. We fought 2 wars against you. In fact, our republic was born fighting against you. And in 1812, you came back and actually occupied Washington, D.C., and burned down the White House. Based. I'm kidding. But you broke the Spanish Armada. Napoleon was never able to defeat you. You took on the Germans in 2 world wars and were victorious in both. Something I always remember from Ernst Junger's memoir, Storm of Steel, about the terrible trench fighting in World War I, is where he writes of an Englishman who fought through the German lines and fell mortally wounded. Junger wrote, "The sergeant practically had both legs sheared off by hand grenade splinters. Even so, with stoical calm, he kept his pipe clenched between his teeth to the end. This incident, like all our other encounters with the Britishers, left us pleasantly impressed with their bravery and manliness. One may have fought the British, one may have even hated the British, but one always respected the British." Now, the UK is only 94,000 square miles, while the United States is over 3.5 million square miles. Our land mass is 40 times bigger than yours. And yet, in very recent history, the British Empire was almost 14 million square miles, a quarter of the total land area of the planet. The largest empire in history. The Mongols, the Romans, nobody else even comes close. For over 100 years, you were the global hegemon. Very recently. Again, looking at it from the big picture, the question that stumps us is, what happened? What happened? Well, it all fell off for you guys after the Second World War. Now, the same thing happened after 1945 to the Empire of Japan and to the German Reich. But it's easier to understand what happened there. These countries were on the losing side in the worst war in human history. Their cities were bombed to rubble. Their fighting-age male population was devastated. They were utterly destroyed and occupied, and the terms imposed on them were unconditional surrender. But Great Britain won the Second World War. So this doesn't make sense. Or should I even say Great Britain anymore? This is very confusing for Americans. England, Britain, Great Britain, the British Empire, the UK, we never know which to use. The Commonwealth. What the hell is a Commonwealth? Churchill called the Second World War your finest hour. I think this is probably the biggest cope in all of history. You won the Second World War and promptly lost the whole British Empire. I think this is probably unique in the history of the world. We know about the fall of the Roman Empire, how Rome was sacked by the barbarians. We know about the fall of Constantinople to the Turks. But as far as I can tell, London was never sacked by an invading army. This is a question that more British people should ask themselves. It's inexplicable to the rest of the world. And no matter how you feel about the empire, whether you feel it was a good thing or it wasn't, or whether that it was ultimately good for white British people or not, since it went away, there's obviously been a precipitous drop-off in power and prestige for your country. And this is inseparably linked to the racial replacement you're now experiencing at home. Like a huge ship sinking, the water that was once displaced by this vast object is now rushing into the space that it once occupied. The empire sunk so rapidly and with such force that it's sucking in all the races from the colonies who were once its subjects right here into the home territory. Instead of decolonization leading to the self-determination of sovereign nations, as we were all promised, it's gone from English rule over India to Indian rule over England in less than 80 years. Now, I don't need to recount to you any of the daily stories of atrocities against white Britons by migrants, of the countless rapes, beatings, and murders that go on in this country against women, children, and the elderly, or how this totalitarian government polices your thoughts and speech to prevent you from speaking out against it. You all know this only too well. You also know how your rulers note with satisfaction that the white population of England has gone down from 94% to 73% since 1990, an over 20% decline in just 30 years. And you've had on average, I guess, about 500,000 a year since the early 1990s. And your rulers are also only too happy to tell you that white indigenous British people will be a minority on these islands in your own lifetime. They call this demographic change or transition. Now, from an American perspective, this is staggering. Most of us in the United States trace our families back 100, 200, or 300 years in North America. The longest any white bloodline anywhere, Spanish, has been in America is about 500 years. But here, whites have been indigenous to these islands for over 40,000 years. This is a blood and soil nationality as much as any nation on earth. So the racial displacement by foreigners from India, Africa, and the Middle East is all the more unimaginable to us. The only thing that it can be compared to is an invasive species pushing in and disrupting a mature and harmonious ecosystem, driving the native species slowly but inevitably to extinction. In our modern globalized capitalist world, this sadly happens all too often. But when it happens in nature, there are always some environmentalists willing to fight to preserve the native species in their natural habitat, usually white environmentalists. But when European races, who have given more to mankind than all others, are faced with decline and extinction in their own habitats, not only is almost no one willing to fight for their preservation, but those who do are called racists, terrorists, and extremists. They call this country a democracy, but just like in America, no one voted for this. You were never asked. When Enoch Powell gave his Rivers of Blood speech, huge majorities agreed with him. The British people never wanted this. And even now, Patriotic Alternative, the only organization willing to stand up and speak out for the white Britons' right to exist, is incessantly attacked, demonized, blocked from standing in elections, deplatformed from social media and banking, blacklisted by major financial institutions, and has to constantly live under the threat of being banned outright by the government. This is not a free society. Now, back in 1915, Houston Stewart Chamberlain wrote the following about England. He said, "The individual Englishman is brave and honest. The English state is rotten to the core." And he went on to write this. He said, and I'm quoting, "The word marry, so the American philologer Whitney informs us, has no cognate word in the Teutonic languages. From the conquered Celts, it comes from the conquered Celts in whose language it meant a child's game. the Anglo-Saxons took it to express delight at the beauty of a landscape, particularly of woods and meadows. Shakespeare still calls the humming of the bees merry. From this meaning, it assumed the significance of joy in music, particularly in singing. And this third stage then grew into mean innocent gaiety in general. In this so peculiarly descriptive word, the former English people were adequately described. And I do not think that any competent Englishman will contradict me when I say, we were merry, we are no longer so. With the complete decay of country life, and the just as complete victory of the god of commerce and industry, Mammon, all true, simple, heart-easing merriment has departed from England. And Chamberlain concludes his condemnation of the corruption of nobility and debasement of morality by industry, commerce, and finance by quoting John Ruskin. "Let us take no heed of this England. In 100 years it will belong to the dead nations." Chamberlain wrote this again in 1915. It was the ruling class of Britain who brought you to this point. For over 100 years, wise, brave, far-seeing men and women here warned against this decline and downfall. They were called reactionaries, appeasers, even traitors. But they saw it coming with absolute clarity, and many of them were imprisoned, and some of them were even executed. We know the moment when this all still could have been saved. It was July 19th, 1940. On that day, the leader of Germany made a final appeal to reason to Churchill, partially on behalf of the British people. He said, quote, "Neither in this world nor the next can Mr. Churchill and Mr. Renaud in France answer for the suffering they have caused by their counsels and decrees to millions of people. All this, as I said once before, need never have happened. For in October I asked nothing from either France or Britain but peace. From Britain I now hear only one single cry, the cry not of the people, but of the politicians, that the war must go on." And he goes on to say, quote, "Mr. Churchill, or perhaps others, for once believe me when I predict a great empire will be destroyed, an empire that it was never my intention to destroy or even to harm. In this hour, I feel it to be my duty before my own conscience to appeal once more to reason and common sense in Great Britain. I can see no reason why this war must go on." Now, when Churchill pressed on with his senseless war of annihilation against a leader and a country that never made any demands on the British Empire, in fact, they only gave guarantees of friendship and military alliance to defend that empire, Winston Churchill instead turned to a leader who was always open about his wish to dismantle the British Empire, President Franklin D. Roosevelt of my own country. In other words, your prime minister, who swore to carry on the war to save the empire, allied with the world leader who wanted to see it destroyed against the world leader who wanted to see it preserved. Now, we know why he did this. There isn't even any doubt about this. The real authors of Churchill's war were named Samuel Untermeyer, Chaim Weitzman, Henry Strakosch. The historical record has been exposed. The truth is there in plain sight. The British Empire was sacrificed. It was subordinated to the worldwide Jewish empire. And the downfall came swiftly after that. Along with mortgaging off all the treasures and resources of the empire to the United States, Britain also adopted the same anti-racist, anti-Nazi ideology animating Roosevelt's regime. If we're fighting a war to free Europe from fascist, racist imperialism, then naturally our own imperialism has got to go. And if anti-racism is the greatest good, then surely what better good can we do than bring the rest of the empire back here to replace our own white British people? The German cruise ship Monte Rosa, which was used throughout the 1930s to provide the families of working-class Germans with luxury vacations under the Strength Through Joy program, was seized as war booty by the British government And in 1948, under its new name, the Empire Windrush, this vessel was used to import the first black migrants into Britain. You don't get any more anti-Nazi than that. Taking a vehicle of state-sponsored leisure for the German working class and repurposing it, transforming it into a vehicle of demographic replacement for the English working class. The so-called Commonwealth's objectives are now defined as the pursuit of equality and opposition to racism, human rights, gender equality. In other words, the whole purpose of what was the British Empire has been redefined to be anti-fascist, which is just another way of saying anti-white. The empire, founded and built by white British people, has been turned into an instrument of destruction against white British people and their descendants. And after 80 years, the results are in. Churchill and Eden got their way, so did Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair and all the rest of them. The good tree produces good fruit, and the evil tree produces evil fruit. Never in all of history has a world power fallen so swiftly from such towering heights to such depths solely through the willful mismanagement of its ruling class. They were wrong. Mosley, William Joyce, Lord Rothermere, the former King Edward, Enoch Powell, Tyndall, and so many others were right. And it only remains for you British people to save yourselves before it's too late. To throw off this evil ruling class, which was never a democracy, but was always a plutocracy of money and privilege, to throw it off and be done with it. One other story about Britain that made a profound impact on me in my youth was when I read a detailed account of the Battle of the Somme and how almost 20,000 young British men were killed on the first day of the battle. Kitchener's boys, they were called. Ever since I read about that, I've often wondered about those young men. I've wondered what they were like, what kind of homes they grew up in, what kind of Christmases they celebrated with their families, how many of them had children, how many of them left wives or sweethearts behind, and how many of them died without ever having a sweetheart. I've thought about how many of them would have had kids or grandkids or great-grandkids by now. How many family lines and generations were wiped out on that day. And I've tried to add up all the years that they lost collectively had they all lived a normal lifespan. You look around at Britain today, you look at what's happening to this country, and you can't help but thinking, what would those men think about it? Would they even recognize the country that they died for? What would they say, for example, if they watched an hour of the in-your-face anti-white programming on the BBC? What would they think, those 20,000 dead, if they could see the hills and meadows of this beautiful land being chewed up to build migrant housing? What if they could see the future generations of white children being terrorized in their own schools, or the little white girls being raped by migrant gangs? We all know the answer. The same state that used them up as cannon fodder then and called them heroes would today call them racist dinosaurs. There would be no place for them in the new multicultural UK. So my final message to white Britons, from my people, the white American nation: we love you, we sympathize with you, we stand with you in unbreakable solidarity. We face the same enemy. For too long, the Anglo-American alliance, the so-called special relationship, was used by the devils in charge of both our countries as a force for evil in the world. We, the people's true representatives, will make it a force for good. They can try to hold on to power here a little while longer, but they're driving this country into the ground so fast, nature itself is against them. Your job is to build yourselves up so that when this rotten plutocracy falls, it doesn't completely take this people and these islands down with it. And perhaps your job is also happily to give it one final shove on the way out. I know you can do this. All of us who still stand in awe of your British history and your British legacy, which in all the world is second to none, we know you can do this. and will be with you in this fight for your freedom and for your existence through every defeat and setback and through every victory. I want to close with a prayer. And my prayer is not, God save the Queen. My prayer is, God save the British people, God save the homeland of the British races. Thank you.